My name is Luik. I'm a publisher of Pan-Baltic Delphi portals, also some newspapers, particularly Eesti Express Weekly. And our guest today at my webcast is Julia Latynina, a journalist, a writer, a historian. Welcome, Julia.
Thank you.
This war, aggression of Russia towards Ukraine, has brought us many surprises. The last ones have been quite pleasant, but the first terrible surprise for me, Julia, was the sadistic and beastly manner in which the Russian army is conducting their operations. Namely, they are seemingly attacking civilians, killing civilians, shooting at hospitals, shooting at ambulances. In one of your YouTube webcasts, you told us that you have proof that it's not only some soldiers who are just who have gone mad, but this must be their commanders, for instance, tank commanders who gave distinct commands to shoot at evacuating civilians near Mariupol. Would you like to go into detail here?
No, it's not exactly proof, and it was, I have been saying this many times. I have been writing this even in English press, like in The Hill, that Putin's terror is not random, it's a strategy. And yes, obviously one of the examples are the mass killings of civilians who tried to flee the population centers that were occupied by Russian army right in the beginning. And we have seen many cases of people trying to leave and being shot. And I just tried to make head or tail out of it because I've been told by many different people, like the famous Ukrainian journalist Yuri Butusov, who saw such a point, such a stronghold erected near Kharkov, when there were several cars that were destroyed on one side on one road, several cars that were shot at the adjacent road. The same scene was happening near Irpень or Bucha, where tanks were dug in the field, and they were shooting at passing cars. And actually, it was not so much proof because there's no need for a proof in this case. It happened, and when this happens on such a mass scale, obviously it's an order. It's an order from above. Actually, we have some evidence about these orders that were given. For instance, there's a case of a Russian lieutenant who was trying to shield with his body two women who were shot at. He died, as well as the elder of the women. And the other woman, she was the daughter of the one who was killed. She pulled to safety the soldier who was with the lieutenant. And the soldier, he told that it was an order. It was an order, as he said, of politcommissar or politruk, whatever. And it was to shoot at civilians. I was trying to make head or tail of this order. I guess it was the idea that anybody who is leaving the premises is an enemy of the Russian state, and therefore he should be destroyed, or something like this. I am not sure actually of the exact wording of the order, of course, but from the very amount of cases, we can see that it was premeditated. It was not just an excess of some soldier who got wide-eyed and was thinking that maybe it's not a civilian, but somebody who is, who is trying to spy on Russian army or whatever. So unfortunately, this fits into the general strategy of mass terror that Putin employs, like Stalin employed the strategy of mass terror towards Ukraine, not only towards Ukraine, towards Baltic states as well. Except that this time the strategy is not succeeding because of Ukrainian army. But one thing we can state for sure is that while Putin was really absolutely delusional about the fact that he can capture Ukraine, he can capture Kyiv in 3 days, that he has some special agents who are, corrupted by FSB, who will hand over Ukraine to him on a platter. About this, he was delusional, but he was certainly not delusional about the fact that he has to exterminate too many Ukrainians to make them back into Russians, because everything we see around Mariupol, like filtration camps, many prisons in Kherson, people who are being killed or tortured, it's obviously was, prepared beforehand. So Putin was preparing for mass terror, and it was a strategy.
Yulia, there was a detail, an interesting one, which you were elaborating. You were talking about the tanks being parked beside a road where the evacuees, the civilian people from Mariupol were escaping. And you told the audience that in order to shoot a cannon, the tank must start an engine. In order for the soldiers to start an engine, which will be consuming diesel oil, of course, they must have a clear order from the commander. Is this true?
I was just retelling what was told to me by Oleg Zhdanov, who is a military expert, who is the former member of Ukrainian General Staff, who is a colonel. And I have no expertise with tanks myself, as can be easily deduced. So when we were discussing cases like this was one of the examples that Oleg Zhdanov gave to me. It was not at Mariupol. It was at an autobahn that was going into Kyiv from Bucha and Irpin. But yes, there were tanks dug in. I think it was at Belogorovka, if I'm not exactly mistaken, but I do not remember. I have to check up on the name. But yes, the tanks were dug in. And yes, if you are shooting with a tank at something, the tank should consume diesel, should consume fuel. And yes, you cannot do this just offhand. The tank commander should have been in the tank as well.
That's terrible. The same shock I experienced when our Rotary Club from Tallinn, we bought and organized 75 ambulance cars like Mercedes and Volvos to Ukraine and to the Terroborona, the civil guard. And at the border of Poland and Ukraine, those gentlemen painted those ambulances into camouflage colors. Can you imagine? Because they told the Russians are going to shoot at the ambulance. What's the point? What's the point of this Hamasization? Like it's like Hamas is randomly shooting Israelis. What is the point for a Russian army officer to give this type of command?
There were many instances in which such commands were given, because here one of my colleagues, Yelena Kostyuchenko, she has documented a case where in Nikolaev, there was an ambulance who was driving out of Nikolaev, and it was totally destroyed. I can quote another example, which is very telling, because in Mariupol, the first things to be destroyed were hospitals. When I have been talking to the mayor of Mariupol, so there were even cases when the attacking army, it said, please go away from this hospital. It started shelling the hospital. I would try to be more exact what exactly he did tell me. The hospitals were targeted in Mariupol especially, as we have footage of this. And this is very similar to what has been happening in Syria, because in Syria we have documented instances where the Red Cross was giving Russian troops the list of hospitals which are civilian hospitals and shouldn't be bombed. And they were expressly bombed after this list was taken. So maybe the generals was thinking along the lines that If the Red Cross is giving us this list, then it has been subverted by ISIS or rebels, and this is where the rebels are. Or maybe this was just a strategy of sheer terror. Because for the sake of me, I have been even talking to the people who ran the Mariupol drama theater. I mean, who were managing it not when it was a drama theater, but when it was a shelter. Because the reason so many people were in the theater was just because people started naturally gravitating towards the shelter. And then some volunteers started organizing it as a shelter, and more people started coming. And there was a couple who was virtually running the whole operation. Their name is Zabagonsky. So basically these two people, one was an actor in the theater, the other was, she was watching over the light. I don't know how the profession is called. So it's somebody who manages the lighting in the theater. So
illuminator,
they were
probably, or something.
Yes, they were volunteers who were organizing the whole thing. And for the sake of me, I was always asking for this very question. Why did theater get bombed? And I still don't know the answer. One of the tentative answers I can give is that before the bombing, just a couple of days before the bombing, the people from Azov, they came into the theater. They came to help. And they filmed a video about the theater. Azov had nothing to do with the theater, except that sometimes it supplied the theater with refugees, because it was very uncomfortable for Azov that some people are sitting underground in Azovstal. And they wanted to take these people out, so it won't be told that Azov is, covering itself with civilians and is treating them like hostages. So we're trying to push these people away, and there was a group of these people who was pushed into the theater. Actually, it was not very happy, because it said that in Azovstal the conditions were better, because they had obviously, everything prepared for a long siege. It was a Soviet type bomb shelter and theater. In the theater, it was all very, hastily organized. There was not a lot of food. The food was distributed whenever you
Julia,
could find it.
I just must interrupt.
Yes.
I must tell you that by chance I saw your stream, and those two people, those workers, employees of the theater, they were quite angry that the civil people started to break those theater seats. They have just been renewed. You remember that? Break them, and of course to turn them.
Absolutely,
what to do?
Yes, because I think it's a fascinating story, and I think it's a story that can be made into a very huge play, because it's fantastic how this theater was like a Noah's Ark. Because it was not suited actually to accommodating many people, because look, it had toilets, for instance. Well, theaters' toilets are not suited for thousands of people staying in the theater for days and days and days. And actually, the lady who was managing the theater, who was, say, the chief manager, she was, can you imagine it, cleaning the toilets herself. And you should understand that it was freezing temperatures and there was no water. So the task of simply cleaning it, and actually I think that's true leadership, because, leadership, you assume leadership, you could have sent somebody else to clean the toilets. She did it herself. They were getting wood from somewhere, and they were not cutting down the trees in the park. They were getting, distributing foodstuffs, distributing clothes, distributing, anything to cover you with. water, things like this. It was absolutely terrific, and it was bombed in the end. So, and actually she was quite angry at Azov itself. Yes, the lady was quite angry at Azov itself. Not that she could reproach Azov with something, but it was clear that, she was managing this thing, and she was looking after the well-being of the people inside. And Azov obviously had, other goals. For instance, Azov came and demanded some cars to take away the people who were wounded and who were dead. And obviously, Azov, it was absolutely, okay to demand this. But the lady in question, she was very angry because she said, look, the people who came to theater, these are the people who want to leave, and they came with their cars because they're waiting for the time to leave. And by taking their car, you're depriving them of the possibility to leave. And obviously she has her, her own point of view, and this is also completely justified. So it was very interesting to watch this interplay of emotions of girls. And the lady, as I've said, she absolutely confirmed that Azov, which she didn't particularly like, that Azov has nothing to do with the theater. But she said that Azov filmed a video about the theater, saying that it is very well run, it is very well organized, and if you have problems, please come to the theater. You may be evacuated from it. So my guess is that maybe somebody saw this film and somebody, and reported that this is the place run by Azov or something like this. I actually don't have good explanations. I have only bad explanations for what was happening. And can I just ask?
Fair enough. I remember also inside this video, the lady you interviewed was telling that the pilot who bombed and killed those people who had been escaping into the shelter in this very famous theater. Now, the pilot, after dropping the bombs, was still circulating around town. So this guy knew exactly that it was this target, this theater, and there was also a sign saying "Deti," children. Where are those famous Wunderwaffen of Russians? Is this all they have? Which they have demonstrated throughout those 6 months of war in Ukraine. And where's the Armata tank, for instance? Tell us about the wonderful weapons, heavenly weapons, the Wunderwaffen.
Oh, Armata tanks is a perfect tank is a perfect example, because you won't believe it. But this is the story I had from two of my friends who are still in Russia. And he's asking Russian patriots, where is Armata? And the answer is, you won't believe it. It's a joke, of course, but these people are saying this with straight faces. It's too valuable to be used in Ukrainian battlefields. And the other answer is, you won't believe it. It's a strategy. We're showing our real enemy is the United States. So we're showing them our diminished capabilities on purpose, so that to lure them into the sense of false security. And if we have to fight with America, there will be Armata. Did I surprise you?
Oh, indeed. So that's all about faces and theater. I'm a previous theater critic, by the way. Tell me, there's a very famous audio, the only tape recording.
Yes. Can I just elaborate a little bit on this? Because yes, speaking about Putin wonder weapons. I think, but speaking, of course, seriously, and not just this Armata joke, which is not a joke, which is really people trying to explain away the reality. because Putin was absolutely delusional. He was saying that he has weapons he does not have, and he probably really believed he has them. But I can give you one example which I think is very fitting and very important, and characterizes basically what's happening inside Putin's head and inside Russian ideology and the state of deterioration of military industry under Putin. This is the example. That's the ballistic nuclear intercontinental missile called Saturn. It's SS-18. It's a famous missile that is still the foundation. It was put into service back in year 1975. And it is actually the foundation of Russian nuclear force, which is pretty important to Putin because without nuclear weapons, he will be just, an African dictator whom nobody fears. And he will be dealt with quickly. So the amount of Saturn is really a very good rocket from a technical point of view. It is able to go into space. It does not do this nominally because there's a treaty that prevents this. But from the physical point of view, it can go into space, and the rocket that is civilian rocket that is called Dnieper, that is based on Saturn, it goes into space and it has payload of 4.5 tons. It is absolutely invulnerable to any American air defense, anti-missile defense, because there is no missile defense in the United States or anywhere else which can take out a ballistic rocket, especially a number of ballistic rockets with warheads. And it has 10 warheads and 40 decoys. And these warheads, when they enter the atmosphere at hypersonic velocities, because every warhead that is entering the atmosphere, it's doing this at hypersonic velocity because of the laws of physics. And the number of Saturns that Putin can dispose of, it diminishes rapidly. It dropped from hundreds to 46 back in year 2016. And as I've said, it's vital to Putin. And the point is that he's boasting very often of his new missile, ballistic missile, which is called Sarmat, which is still not on active duty, which is still in the it's still in the preliminary launches, and it's boasting about Sarmat that it can do all these things I enumerated, that it can fly into space, that it can overcome any air defense, that its warheads are entering the atmosphere at hypersonic speed. And of course, the obvious question is what is Sarmat? And the funny answer is that this Sarmat is just a copy of Saturn. Actually, it's sort of because Saturn was manufactured in Ukraine, in what is now Ukraine. And this is the reason their number is falling down, because obviously Ukraine is not servicing these rockets. And the only thing Putin is trying to do for the last 8 years is to manufacture a rocket, is to manufacture a missile that is actually exactly like Saturn. Well, maybe there are some bells and whistles because obviously time has changed. It's almost 50 years old. But the point I'm telling you is that he did not yet succeed, despite the fact that it's very simple reverse engineering. It's Soviet components. It's a Soviet missile. It's not something out of outer space or from United States or even from Israel. And obviously, and it's vital to his survival as somebody who can, who is a big guy in the world. So if he cannot repeat even this vital stuff, this speaks volumes about the decrepit state of Russian war industry.
All right. So it appears that the Sarmat, which Putin claimed has no analogues, is a copy itself. Understood. This is again a part of another scene of Russian war theater. But my question now is about the sustainability of Russian military production. You might have heard about the only recording there is from the maniac Adolf Hitler when he doesn't shout speeches, but he analytically talks to Finnish General Mannerheim about the ability of the Russians to produce tanks. He tells that he didn't see this in Adolf Hitler's worst dreams. And the only city which he mentions with a big surprise is, of course, Kramatorsk of Ukraine. But are the Russians, I mean, the Russian great military conglomerate called Rostec, are they able to produce more rockets as the war goes, more ammunition, or are they in such a dire need of Western elements, Western pieces in those rockets that this would be impossible?
I'm afraid here I will say that, first of all, there's not only rockets, but just shells. And we see no sign of a shell shortage at the front, except there are HIMARSs that are destroying Russian armor dams. And there is counter-battery fire that is destroying a lot of Russian guns itself. But still, there's not a considerable drop in the amount of shells that are being lobbed at Ukrainians. I would say I've been speaking to the people at the front. The estimates vary, but some say at best from 1 to 20, it went down to 1 to 5. But the other people, those who are fighting at Kharkov, they're saying it's maybe a 20% reduction. So here I have to warn the optimists. Soviet Union has been stockpiling weapons for ages and ages and ages. It has been preparing for the Third World War. And obviously, all these shells are right now at the disposal of Mr. Putin. Yes, they are old. Some of them don't function. I do remember Peter Kotin. This is the head of Ukrainian Energoatom, telling me a very telling example. Actually, I think it's sort of, something that signifies for me the vagaries of this war. When Russian tanks were shelling the nuclear power station at Zaporozhye, they were using shells, and some of the shells did not explode because they were too old. So, the whole idea of, on the one hand, shelling the nuclear power station and hitting directly the reactor building, and on the other hand, some of the shells not exploding because they are too old. That's highly symbolic, I think, of this war. So we see that despite the fact that some of the shells don't explode, Putin has a lot of them, and I don't see, they will end someday. There's another question with rockets, with missiles. Some of these missiles are also quite old, and Russia has been also stockpiling them for ages. For instance, missiles like X-22, which is a very old missile, which has, I forgot how it's in English, because it's круговое вероятное отклонение. So the area, how many meters, how would you say it, Hans? Круговое вероятное отклонение, I'm sorry.
We'll find a proper translation. We are going to have text beneath the video, no problem.
Okay,
so,
yes. sorry. So that's by how many meters or how many hundreds of meters you can miss, and X-22 can miss by about 300 meters. Well, that's the type of missile, for instance, that hit the Kremenchuk Mall. So these are missiles that are very old. I think it was built first back at the end of 50s, not even at the beginning of 60s. And they have been probably stockpiled since then. Of course, some of them has to be, some of them cannot be already used, but there's a huge stock of these missiles. There's a different question when it comes to some missiles that are really new, because some of them are not simply used, but actually they never existed, or they not to say never existed, like Armata, the famous Armata. They existed in just several copies that were more for the show. The obvious example here is a missile called Kinzhal. It's really very effective. It's really hypersonic. I mean, from physical point of view, it's hypersonic. When it's reaching its target, it's streaking through the air at hypersonic speed. It is impossible to intercept. It's striking straight at the target. But there are several problems with manufacturing the Kinzhal, because really Kinzhal is just a ballistic missile, famous Russian ballistic missile, which Russia really has, called Iskander. It's produced in fairly large quantities, but Kinzhal, translated as Deja, is a variety of Iskander that is put under the belly of a MiG fighter. And well, first of all, this particular ballistic missile is not well suited to be put under the belly of a MiG fighter. You can put only 2 of them, not even 3. Actually, you can put 3 if you're taking them someplace. But if they have fuel inside it, then you can put only 2. So the fighter in question is not very well suited to launching these missiles because it was used for totally different purposes. It's very ungainly in the air in this configuration. As one of my friends, a former fighter pilot himself, Roman Svitan, put it, he said it's like putting a Mercedes and just a second.
Lada?
No, not Lada. Just a second. How could I forget the word?
Trabant?
Telega.
Metal? Железо?
No. No. Telega. The
Carriage.
Yes.
A carriage, you mean?
Yes. Okay. Say it's like putting Mercedes in front of a horse carriage. So obviously it was something that was made to show Mr. Putin that he has a missile, a ballistic missile, that when it's being taken up in the air on a fighter, which travels itself at a considerable speed, can later reach hypersonic speed. And technically it is so. But really it's a very ungainly contraption that first of all is not so, it's a configuration that's not really walkable. And it's probably a weapon that has been existing in dozens, perhaps hundreds of copies, but not much, because we actually don't see much Kinzhal being used in Ukraine. When it is used, it is really being used, unfortunately, with devastating accuracy. For instance, this is partly my own theory, but I would say that, unfortunately, I think it can be quite well deducted and confirmed. Do you remember the strike in Vinnytsia, which took the lives of 3 children? Yes, and several adults, and it was claimed by Russia that it was some meeting that was being held in the House of Officers, which was purely bullshit because the House of Officers in question...
Nobody holds nowadays officers meeting in the House of Officers. They dance and sing there, I guess, those children.
Yes, it's just a concert hall. So they used 4 caliber rockets to do this. Actually, they used 8 caliber rockets, but only 4 reached their goal, their destination.
Yulia, how much does one cost? How much does 1 caliber cost, by the way?
I'm afraid I forgot, but some of them cost over $1 million, and I think a thing like X101 will cost around $13 million. But I'm not sure right now about caliber. I have to look it up. If you know, tell me, because but it should be
$6.5 million, but I might be.
Probably, yes. I was afraid to mention the figure because I could have mixed it up, because there are missiles that are even more expensive than calibers. But yes, I think it is around the vicinity of $7 million. So they used to, around they used around how much? $60 million to kill 3 children, but Putin spares nothing for the children, it seems. So the point I'm trying to make is that at the time this was happening, and this seemed pretty senseless, even for Putin, but there was a Russian AVAX, a jet that is designed for radio electronic interception. At this time, it's called A-10. It was flying in Belarus, and it was registering all the cases of when the air defense radars in Ukraine sprang into life. And obviously, when a missile is flying, like the calibers that were flying to Vinnytsia, and nobody knew where they are flying because obviously they are flying from the Black Sea. So obviously everything on their path under Kiev, even up to Rovna, was started illuminating the sky. And the aircraft in question, it took it all down. And later, the missile I mentioned first, the Kinzhal, the very precise missile, it took out some installations at Vinnytsia airfield, which it seems to me, nobody is talking about that in Ukraine. But I have heard rumors that yes, it was an exact strike. There was a lot of valuable equipment that was destroyed. It was a success. And it seems that the lives of these 3 children and other people who were adult, they were just used as a decoy. They were used, this idea does not leave me. Maybe I'm not right because after all, I'm an historian and I'm not a military specialist. But I've been discussing this with military specialists, especially with Mr. Svitan, who told me first about this jet that was flying in Belarus. And it looks like the Belarusian jet, the jet that was in Belarus, because it's Russian, it's, as I've said, it was for electronic interception. It was registering where everything is situated. When he saw the radars going up, it registered where the important equipment is, and this brought down the strike later on.
Okay.
So, finishing your answer about... Sorry, Hans. Yes, this was a very, very extended answer to your question about the amount of shells and missiles Putin can spend. And the answer... I'm sorry, I'm once again elaborating on this. And the answer is that the number of shells he has is infinite. The number of low precision rockets he has is very high. The number of high precision rockets is probably running out Of course, Russian factories will be able to manufacture some of them, but yes, it is running out. But the horrible truth is, if you consider his mode of fighting, his type of fighting, he actually was never into precision. He was just imitating precision. It's actually the worst thing that Russian army does. It just hits whatever it hits, and then reports not only to public, but I think to Putin, that it hit something important. And the amount of mistakes it's doing is really amazing because, for instance, we can quote this situation when in Odessa, an apartment house was hit. It was also, and 3 people were killed, a mother, a daughter, and a grandmother. And then Russian Ministry of Defense announced that they hit an important logistic target, an important ammunition depot that is situated in an airfield, blah, blah, blah. So obviously they did miss because the airfield was nearby. But what is horrible about this story is that the airfield in question has been shut down 30 years ago. It was a flea market. It was in Odessa. You know, you could have just looked up the internet to see this. But obviously these people, they are, really using the manuals, the old Soviet manuals that date back to 30 or 40 years, whatever. And they see that there was an airfield. Then they launch a rocket. It's an unprecision one. It hits whatever it hits. And then they report to Putin that they hit an important target. It's incredible the amount of lying Russian army is doing. And perhaps the most important thing is that, first of all, I'm sure it's lying to Putin, not only to the public. Sorry, there was another, to finish it, very important thing that I wanted to say, but I think I forgot the point. Okay, so we move on. Maybe I'll remember it.
Okay, so that's about Russian hardware. Hopefully we're not going to see it demonstrated in the Baltic states. But what about the human factor? Russian intelligence has been world famous in their numbers of defecting intelligence officers like Gordievsky, Suvorov, Yuri Shvets, Zhirnov, who lives currently in France. Why don't they defect right now? And another question. Everybody in Ukraine, probably also in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in Czechia, and in the Baltic states was looking forward for the Russian plain soldiers to defect. There's a Russian league in Ukraine, which I must mention is a very small one, even compared to what is it, Kalinovsky Polk, the Kalinovsky regiment, who is manned with Belarusians, and there's much more people there. Why don't they defect? Do they enjoy what they are doing, or what?
Okay, that's a very good question because I have been pondering it myself. So first, I'll answer the question about spies. Of course, there was some defectors like the famous Sergei Skripal, but he defected just for money. Not actually defected, he betrayed his own organization, and I'm using the word betrayal because, first of all, he did it for money. There was, has no higher ideological values. This was the guy who was sitting in Great Britain and who was watching, Russian First State channel until he was poisoned by his countrymen, and he was saying things like "Krim nash." So this was a typical example of Putin's Secret Service guy who was selling whatever he can. And since he could sell only state secrets, in this case, he was selling state secrets. But the reason Russian Secret Service agents did not desert before the war is very simple, because there were no, first of all, they were mostly people who were serving for money, not for high ideological values. And I would say there was no iron curtain between Russia and the West. Basically, they could lead the same life in Russia, And their life in Russia was much more privileged because they were taking bribes, they were, enjoying good things of life, and there was nothing they could sell. Basically, Russia was not very interesting to anybody. I think that Skripal didn't get paid much. But what is interesting is that right after the war, a number of defections did start. And here I'm referring to my very good friend, Vladimir Osechkin, who is doing an incredible job. I think he rivals only Bellingcat, because in Bellingcat we see an open source investigation agency which is doing wonders, which is outperforming, I think, a lot of intelligence services. Because myself, I am always very distrustful of intelligence services, secret services, because when nobody can see what you're doing, you are prone to exaggerations and falsehoods. And we have seen it in Trump dossier. We have seen it in cases that have nothing to do with Soviet services. So Bellingcat is fantastic because you're competing on a market. Everybody can see that you're doing a very great job. And we can see that sometimes Bellingcat does consult. For instance, it consulted German's General Prosecutor Office, or whatever it is called, I don't know, in the case of this murder on a bike in Berlin. Because they knew everything about the killer, and the German authorities, they could not make head or tail of it. So the guy who rivals Bellingcat single-handedly is my good old friend, Vladimir Osechkin, the founder of Gulagu.net, which was originally a site that has a very, very specific task, that of fighting torture in Russian prisons. But then some people started running over to Mr. Osechkin, starting with some of the people who had evidence about this torture. And then people inside Russian secret services, they just realized they have an option to run away after the beginning of the war. And now Mr. Osechkin has collected quite a string of refugees. For instance, his latest newcomers is a secret service agent who was watching over Russian nuclear installations and Russian nuclear works in Sarova. Another guy is a nuclear physicist over whom this secret agent was watching. People like that. His latest addition is a man I would highly recommend to your attention. His name is Pavel Filatyev. This is the guy who fought in the war, who enlisted in Russian army just before the war. He was appalled by what he saw. He stayed at the front for several months.
Is this the guy who published the book? Who published the book?
Yes, this is exactly the guy who published the book.
Yes, I know.
And actually, I read the book. I can say it is surprisingly a very good book. It is full of first of all, it's full of incredible factual descriptions. Mr. Filatyev, who is describing for a month before the war, they were, thrown into almost prison or concentration camp conditions on the training grounds. They were freezing, they had no proper food, they had no proper shelter. They were kept like this for a month, like dogs, like prisoners. And then they were sent to Ukraine, and this is just one of the cases when, this is just actually one of the reasons Russia lost war, because, people are losing the ability to fight in such conditions. He's describing many horrible things in his book. Of course, he's heavy on describing the difficulties that befell the dutiful soldiers of Russian army. And he's very scarce, becomes very scarce when he's describing what happened to the local population. He admits that Russian army did robberies. He didn't describe this in a book, but in an interview with me, he described how after his commander of his detachment, he looted a lot of stuff in Kherson, computers and the like. He put it all in a truck, and he drove the truck then off to the front, to Nikolaev. I don't know what happened to the truck, but Mr. Filatyev says that the commander was not very respected among the other soldiers. Filatyev also mentions something that's completely true, that when you have been given no food, no shelter, no nothing, of course you start robbing. And he is quite frank in describing this. And for instance, he describes how in his first night in Kherson, he was loath to go into any house to become a robber, but he simply had nothing to sleep in, literally. And it was freezingly cold. So he went into some shed, not into the house. He got out some, they were not even wraps or whatever it was, like some sheets of something. So he sheltered himself with this stuff. But obviously not everybody was, I believe him that he did exactly the thing he is writing about. But obviously not everybody was as scrupulous as Mr. Filatyev. And as I've said, he's heavy on descriptions of his own miseries. He's a little bit light on what has been happening to local population, understandably. He's somebody who says, we started calling each other brothers. It's hard to him to betray the brothers.
Yes.
But this is the guy who can, for instance, write, and the book is filled of these gems, who can, for instance, write, in Russian military institutions, they teach you the only one thing to perfection, and this is to carry out the orders of the superiors, however stupid they are. I think the guy who writes like this, and this is on every page, it's really good. I wouldn't say that it's so the book is quite interesting, very interesting. It's a document, and I hope he will write the continuation.
Yulia,
And
I'm sorry to
actually-
interrupt. Yulia, I'm sorry to interrupt. Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. I'm
Yes,
talking
and
to you
actually
from
I can-
Tallinn now, and don't you're underestimating us, Yulia. Of course, we have already in our Delphi portal translated some extracts from this book, but I'm after this episode now with you, I'm going to read it full, of course, because those could be the people who land in our territory someday, as they did in 1940.
I think the Ukrainians are taking care of that. I think the probability of Russian troops landing in Estonia is going down with every month. But yes, if Putin did succeed in Ukraine, you would have been the next. Yes, and can I speak
Right,
of Filatyev? Yes, Hans, very important thing, because the
course.
guy has been working all his life. He enlisted in the army only, for the last several months. And actually, he was dealing with horses. He's a professional guy who can, he's a horse master or whatever you call it in English. So I think it's very important. Maybe some of the people will listen to this and they will say, aha, so this guy is now in France. Okay, maybe he'll ask for political asylum, but obviously he has to do something. This is a very clever guy who was an underdog all his life, maybe because of his excess of intellect. But he needs, I think, two things. He needs to write, and he needs some job. And I think horses are a perfect job for him. So that's just a hint.
So we are arriving to the topic of Russian immigration. When I discussed this with Mark Fagin, whom you know perfectly well, I know, we elaborated on the idea that the Russian emigration, I guess, in Europe, including Ukraine, there might be, let's say, 500,000 Russian emigres. They don't have a representation, but the electronic voting, let's say the blockchain possibility of electronic voting are there. What do you, Julia, think of the idea of creating an elected body for you to represent emigre Russians in the front of European Union, the countries, in the front of Russian Federation, if needed? And do you think it a good idea that this elected body, if this would be happening someday, could be advising the European Union in the question, who are the so-called good Russians? There no doubt will be good Russians who would be worth European visas, but this body, let's say 5 people, would be in a position to exactly detect which are the good Russians. Not much of them, I'm afraid, but there are, I'm sure. What do you think of the elected body and the good Russians?
Okay, if you want to detect the opinions of Russians, it should be done not with a body, but with a specific technology, IT technology, blockchain, whatever, a network. So I think this is something that should govern itself and not be subject to any body, even elected body. First of all, so there are 2 separate questions. Of course, there can be somehow intervalidated, I would say. One can validate the other. But speaking of representation of a Russian government in exile, so there are 2, there's an old story about on the one hand, on the other hand. I hate answers like this.
Yes.
So first of all, why not to try? If we don't succeed, we lose absolutely nothing. We can at least say we tried. After having said this, and after having expressed my faith into, new digital world, which can organize people into networks, social networks. After all, this government can be organized along the lines of the social network, something like this. Blockchain, whatever. Actually, when I was also discussing it in my show, and a lot of people who are IT specialists wrote to me saying that this is how it should be built, or this is my idea, I'm willing to participate in it, blah, blah, blah. So, as I've said, why not try? On the other hand, I'm a little bit skeptical because anytime you had a government in exile, this was the legal government of a country that was conquered by somebody. For instance, Polish government in exile in London was a legitimate government because Hitler and Stalin conquered Poland, and these guys were in exile. And you could ask, who elected you? And they could say, we were elected by Polish people. So obviously this cannot be said of any Russian government in exile. And I just have to, for instance, point out that after the revolution, after the October Revolution, October coup, really, there was no Russian government in exile. There was a lot of immigration, but there was nothing in exile. Still, as I've said, it's a new age, it's a digital age, and nothing wrong will come out of trying. The idea was vented first, I think, several months ago. Nothing was done. Now it is, now Mark Fagin is adding, is saying that he can try to organize it. I will be happy.
What about Ilya Ponomaryov and his underground free Russian armies? Do you believe in this, or this is an FSB hoax? The killing of the supposed killing of Dugina by this alleged army underground.
Look, I intensely dislike the situation in which people start quarreling with each other in immigration and saying bad things about each other because we are living in a world of hurt. Let us not add to it. Having said this, I would say that I like very much the idea of a Russian army fighting against Putin. And actually, when Ponomarev started sprouting these, I think, crazy ideas about underground organization carrying out terrorist attacks on Russian territory, which seemed absolutely incredible to me. And I think that every such organization will be either organized by FSB or riddled with FSB agents, because this is precisely where they know what to do. So when Ponomarev started saying this, I said that he'd better organize Russian army outside of Russia. He is in Kiev. Kiev is fighting a war. I don't understand why didn't he go to a war fighting in Ukrainian army, or why he did not like Stalin's secretary Bazhenov, who tried in Finland to organize a Russian army fighting against Stalin. Why don't he try to organize a Russian army fighting against Putin in Ukraine? And you know, what do you know? After I said this, within a week he announced that he's organizing such an army. And since it's a very good idea, the army itself, I would try not to be too skeptical of Mr. Ponomarev's abilities to do this. But still, I think that such an army should be organized by somebody who is fighting at the front, who was fighting at the front. As far as I know, Mr. Ponomarev was not fighting at the front. He went into territorial defense for a couple of days, and then he started doing other things. So I don't know if I were a Russian...
There already is a... Okay. Go ahead,
yes.
Julia.
And another thing, speaking of why Russians don't go over to Ukrainian side, and why don't they give up weapons? So here I will say three things. First, I think one of the reasons Putin practiced terror is precisely to prevent Russians from going over to Ukraine. Because when you terrorize the population, you understand there's no way back. I think this was one of the biggest Putin's goals, really. The second point is that it's, from what I've been told, and I have been asking this very question, it is really very difficult in a present-day military situation to go over to somebody who is your adversary, because this war is not fought hand-at-hand. It's fought by artillery duels. The distance between the lines can amount for dozens of kilometers. And if you're trying to cross this distance, you will be shot either by the people who are behind or by the people who are in front, who have no idea you're a deserter. And the third point, well, I've said this, and well, that's it. Okay, I do remember I had a third point I forgot to make.
Okay.
Yes, actually, I do remember what point I wanted to make about Russian missiles hitting wrong targets. There's actually at least one group of targets that is being hit by Russian missiles, and I would say it's a very positive example. Lots of Russian missiles are hitting either airfields or some big areas of land that are designed for military that have some designated military use. But when you're hitting an airfield, in reality, what you are hitting? You are just hitting some territory where you cannot miss. Even if you go 300 meters to the left or to the right, it's still an airfield. Basically, you destroy nothing if your munition is not precise. But you can always report to the guy who is in charge that yes, you did hit an airfield. I believe there's an English proverb about hitting a side of the barn. So it's exactly the same with Russian missiles. A very sizable number of them are hitting the proverbial side of the barn. And I think that's the best use. That's actually the best outcome for everybody, including for those who report to their superiors.
My remark is that Ilya Ponomaryov doesn't need to set up any Russian army in Ukraine because there already is a Russian legion, albeit not very populated, especially in comparison with the Belarusian Kalinovsky regiment and the Belarus people, their soldiers who had defected from maniac Lukashenko to Ukraine. They even don't have a front. Will it be 2 or 12 kilometers? But Yulia, knowing you as a historian of religion,
this is perhaps something I would like to mention because, as I've said, I think creating Russian Legion is a very good idea, and I have been precisely describing that this was one of the things that Mr. Bazhenov, former Stalin's secretary, wanted to do when he came to Finland during the Winter War. Unfortunately, the Winter War just came to an abrupt stop, and he had to flee Finland, so not to be taken by a Russian army. But he succeeded in organizing something. So this is a very good idea, and actually that's speaking about legitimacy of Russian government. Perhaps the only legitimate Russian government can be the one that has Russian military force at its disposal. It's also a very good source of legitimacy. Here, some of the soldiers are listening to us. Except that since there are not many, but some Russians already fighting in Ukraine, I just don't see them coming under the banner of Mr. Ponomaryov, because obviously somebody who has to head this provisional military government is somebody who has been fighting for several months.
Knowing you as also a historian, and you have been writing several books on Jesus Christ, our Savior. Tell me, what do you think about our Pontifex, Pope Francis's planned visit to Kiev or even to Moscow? Should Pope Francis go and shake hands with Patriarch Kirill? Should he be visiting Moscow altogether? Does he have courage of going to visit Kiev? And another question, the popes and the clergy, their task is not only to say prayers at a very nice morning at this very famous Vatican Square. Shouldn't they be having to behave more actively? For instance, just standing in front of the Mariupol city gate and just be there, be present, be maybe sacrificing, as the popes have constantly done throughout history.
I don't remember actually many popes sacrificing themselves throughout history. I do remember a couple of bishops during the only real persecution that haven't happened. That's the time of Emperor Diocletian. A couple of bishops, not a couple, actually dozens of bishops, renouncing their faith, including the Pope of Rome, who was actually the Bishop of Rome at this time, and the Bishop of the whole Africa. I'm just mentioning these two authors because these were precisely the people that were later installed by Constantine as the chief hierarchs of the church. But that's neither here nor there.
Yulia, I would like to argue. I think several of the, let's say, first 10 popes died as martyrs, and very forcefully. But okay, leave this aside. What about Pope Francis now? his visit?
Look, here I will argue with this because we don't. Here I will argue with this, but that's not about Pope Francis. Look, Pope Francis seems more intent on fighting global warming than following the tenets of old intolerant Christian faith. I just don't think anything about Pope Francis. I just don't really interested in people who are fighting social injustice in the West and global warming and blah, 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 and don't have the guts to stand up to Putin, because I think that's partly what made Putin so dangerous, what enabled him. When he saw that nobody is standing up to real bullies and everybody is fighting imaginary troubles. Speaking of the first popes, or rather of the first bishops of Rome, because they were bishops at this time. The people who were called popes at this time were bishops of Alexandria, of Antioch, because Rome was a comparative backwater. First of all, we don't know anything about, say, the first 7-10 bishops of Rome. The moment we start hearing about them, really we start hearing very funny things. Like, for instance, we hear about a pope or bishop, as I've said, called Calixte, who is described in detail by his adversary, Hippolytus, who was living already at the beginning. It's already the end of the end of the third. Sorry, it's already 2nd century. So, for instance, we hear about Calixte, that here's the guy who was a freed slave of a palace eunuch, who was actually laundering money for this eunuch, and who was also keeping money of the Christian church. He stole that money. He stole the money of the eunuch. He was thrown into prison, not because he was a martyr, but because he stole the money. He later got out of the prison, and because he had a lot of money, he was appointed first as a supervisor of the graveyards, of Christian graveyards, which was a very lucrative assignment. And then he bought his way. He became a bishop of Rome himself, just buying it. And this is, shall we say, a little bit different from the canonical view of the people who were martyred, who were tortured for their faith. And we see another, the reverse side of the medal. We see that the Christian faith was spreading among the slaves, the freed slaves, but not simply, it's very often said that the Christian faith was spreading among the lower stratas of population. It's not exactly this because, of course, the majority of the believers always came from lower stratas, because every majority comes from somebody who is stupid and who is weak and who is not very clever. Of course, if it's not an Academy of Sciences. But of course, the people who were the most lucrative target were the people who were at the palace and were either the women, because a woman in antiquity, she had no rights. and she was an easy prey for such obvious scoundrels. And the other people who were very often recruited were the freedmen, because Roman Empire, it had very strange bureaucratic structure. It never created bureaucracy proper like in China. It never had any exam system. And after the end of the Republic, where everybody was elected, it obviously started running short of elected officials. So by the time Roman Empire started changing into bureaucracy, the bureaucracy was recruited mostly from the emperor's freedmen or from his former slaves or from eunuchs or from people like that who were, shall we say, not very intelligent, not very honest, not steeped in Asian culture. This was their problem with birth. I'm not saying that they were somehow wrong or whatever, but if you were bought at the market, bred as a slave, and then later freed and became a high-placed imperial official, well, you were up to take bribes. You're up to believe, in stupid things. And such a guy, especially if he was despised by senators, despised by upper classes, but he wielded a lot of power, he amassed a lot of wealth, and he was a very good target for recruitment into Christian sect, or rather different Christian sects and churches, because we should not forget that there were many of these, they were competing, and they all outlived so-called persecutions, but they did not outlive these competing sects like Marcionites or like Montanists. They didn't outlive the triumph of the type of Christian church that called itself Catholic and later Orthodox. I just reminded
okay,
that
very
both
amusing.
were the names of the same church.
I find that I think that we're not the two of us here, but some Holy Ghost must participate, because I triggered a very amusing lecture by just mentioning the Pope Francis, of whom you don't care much, as I understood.
But it's neither here nor there.
Thank you very much. It was splendid indeed. Just the last question about the future.
And I have to say that that this is not in my books, because my books are dedicated to the early history of Christianity. And actually, the book I'm finishing now is dedicated to the emergence of monotheism, of Jewish monotheism. Yes, so this is just totally extra stuff. And
you also you are also very, very effectively defining Jesus Christ, our Savior, not as love, but rather like sword and fire, which he brings onto cities. But okay, the end of this history lesson now. One question, the last one about the future. In your last column in Novaya Gazeta Europe, you state that there's no place and no time for the phenomenon the Russians are calling shapko kidatelstvo, or bravado, because the Ukraine forces don't have enough armed vehicles or tanks to start a massive counter-attack. What about this? When are they going to amass such a force to start a counter-attack, or do we have to wait for the winter?
Now, here we should be very realistic about what, Ukrainians right now don't have weapons of their own to speak of, because whatever they had, like tanks or armor, it's finished. It's totally finished. Russian army was always superior in the quantity of the armaments it had. The Ukrainian army is running out of guns guns of old Soviet manufacture, and with not many exceptions, right now it's fighting with what is provided by the West. So we can see that the West and United States, they're not providing much. And unfortunately, we can see no signs of change. I have been talking recently, just yesterday, with Ambassador Herbst, who is a very fine man.
Yes.
And who is the head of Eurasia Center at Atlantic Council. And this is precisely the structure that fights tooth and nail for Ukraine, that is in favor of supplying more weapons. And he is one of the principal authors of the famous letter in the Hill that says, provide Ukraine with more weapons. I'm afraid Ambassador Herbst was very pessimistic. I was actually, at the beginning of our conversation, I was more optimistic than at the end, because I thought that the letter really did change something. No, it did not yet. President Biden's administration is still intent on supplying Ukraine with enough weapons so it does not lose, but it doesn't give them anything that is really, really, necessary for them to win, especially to win quickly. So first of all, Russia still has complete fire superiority, if I'm saying this right in English. Подавляющее огневое превосходство.
Absolutely.
And Russia still has much more tanks. Basically, Ukrainian army does not have tanks and does not have armor, because whatever it did have was destroyed. And there are some meager amounts that were supplied recently by Europe, mostly all Soviet trash. And you should understand that in a modern warfare, you cannot really advance without tanks or without armor, because you cannot advance on foot in the 21st century. Moreover, you cannot create any reserve, because any reserve is something you move from one front to the other. You have to also cannot do it on foot. You also have to have armor. So there are two principal things, two principal deficiencies: not enough firepower and not enough armor. And this is very, very serious. And the only thing, so there's another ramification of this, is that actually there's not, especially after the end of the Cold War, some of these weapons are simply absent from Europe. I do remember, I may be mistaken in exact figures, but I can tell you an example when President Macron told Ukrainians that we wanted to supply you with a dozen of Caesars, 12 Caesars. And now we are sending additional 6. And this may seem not much, but you may reassess your previous impression if you understand that, if I'm not mistaken, the whole number of Caesars in French army is 36. Maybe I'm a little bit off in my exact figures, yes. But the order of magnitude is like this. So I'm again, I'm sorry if I'm misquoting a bit, but I think the order of magnitude goes like this. This does not apply to United States Army, which has enormous stockpiles of weapons, but we can see that President Biden is reluctant to part with all of them. And with Europe, very often, Poland is donating a lot. Even Baltic countries are donating a lot, but you don't have much. And what is more surprising, France and Germany simply don't have enough.
All right. At this pessimistic note, we are summing it up. Julia, you're also partly my dear colleague as a journalist, so please keep up your good work. And thank you very much for this very sophisticated interview indeed.
Thank you, but because, this, of course, this is just a very important period of our lives we're living through, and I cannot fight in the front. So I'm trying to do whatever I can. But to tell you really, I'm a little bit tired. And I'm just longing for the time when I can return to my, shall we say, to history and to writing. Actually, I try to do a lot of history and a lot of writing.
And to your home from where you were out-poisoned, as I understand. Юля, я сейчас буду по-русски говорить. Я для вас, вот думаю о вас как историка тоже. Я даже сделал такую фразу, сам придумал. Ceterum censeo, Kremlum esse deletam. Do you understand me? Ceterum censeo, Kremlum esse deletam.
Yes, I concur. I concur, and actually, my old, it's a very old proposition of mine. Sorry to quote myself, is that you should not. That's one of the first things the government of the free Russia has to do, is to take the government out of Kremlin. It's hideous. It's a medieval structure. I don't think it should be destroyed. It could be turned into a museum. Why should you destroy a very old piece of... but, right. You know, have you been to Milan? There's a Sforza castle, very similar to Kremlin, right in the middle of the city. And it's a museum, of course. But nobody in his sane mind would ever... think of putting a government inside castle walls. This was done in medieval times for obvious reasons. This was done by Bolsheviks also for obvious reasons. But even in Imperial Russia, I just want to pay your attention to the fact that Zimny doesn't have castle walls. It's just a big home. In Ekaterina's palace in Ekaterina's palace outside of St. Petersburg didn't have walls. Actually, it was open to everybody. Palaces of late European monarchs, they were open to everybody. They were easily accessible. The whole idea of putting something inside walls, it's horrible. And that's the first sign, the first architectural sign of a totalitarian government.
I have visited both the Peter I's house in Petersburg, which is very tiny, and our Peter I's house in Tallinn, we have one. Very tiny, yes. All right. Have a nice evening, and we'll publish this as soon as possible. Thank you very much. It was very fruitful. Have a nice time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.